So my video is on the significant art of the Hundred Years' War. This is by Kira Sotos. So to give a brief history of the Hundred Years' War, just so we have some context when talking about the artwork, it was basically a collection of battles between the French and the English over the span of about 116 years. The warfare began in 1337 and ended in 1453, and the main dispute was around territorial English jurisdiction over French land. So the biggest conflict over French territory was the English succession to the French throne. In fact, this is actually how the warfare began. King Edward III, a very powerful English king, known for his many successful military excursions, initiated the war by invading Flanders to claim the French throne. He was an important figure known for giving England the upper hand during the beginning of the war, but after 80 years of warfare, the French eventually rose to power during the Siege of Orleans, which was a big turning point for their victory. After this battle, they were able to sustain their power and eventually officially won the Hundred Years' War after the Battle of Castillon, and after this, France was able to proceed as a separate state with its own independence and power. Alright, so now that we know some context to the Hundred Years' War, I want to start off with this piece called The Battle of Sluys. It's an illustration from the book Jean Froissart's Chronicles, and the piece is illustrated by Loisette Lidé, who did a lot of the illustrations for Froissart's Chronicles, particularly the first and second volume. So this is a very important book of prose that encapsulates the Hundred Years' War through many first-hand eyewitnesses. So it gives a really accurate portrayal of many of the battles that actually went down during the war. It gives us a sense of how historians and artists really worked hand in hand during a time when there wasn't photography and easily accessible databases. And anyways, back to the piece itself, it's actually one of the most significant of Froissart's Chronicles because it capitalizes on an English victory that was a very decisive moment in history. It's actually England's first official naval victory during the Hundred Years' War. And we can see this through the large war boats that take up most of the illustration. The illustration itself is also fairly simple, and was most likely like this so that anyone from any ranking or time period could understand what was happening. And one thing I'd like to note that brings me to the next piece is the prevalence of the longbowed soldiers. This is actually a weapon that gave England the high ground during the Hundred Years' War for a long period of time. So the next illustration we're going to look at is the Battle of Crécy by Loisette Lidé again, and again, this is from Jean Froissart's Chronicles. Like we saw in the Battle of Sluys illustration, we see the invention of the longbow, which was used as an advantage over the French, and this is an art piece that I found particularly significant, again out of Froissart's Chronicles, because it flaunts the invention of a weapon that provided notable strategic advantage during such a long-fought warfare. The reason the longbow was actually so advanced and useful was due to its ability to shoot long range, and something that's focused on in the illustration is the fact that it's able to shoot more arrows per minute than the crossbow could shoot. And it's also a lot easier for them to load arrows into the longbow, as opposed to the soldier on the left that needs a moment and takes on a vulnerable stance to reload his crossbow. And that brings me to another piece which I included as a little extra. So the reason I say that this piece is a little bit of like a bonus or an extra is technically it's created preemptive to the Hundred Years' War, but I wanted to include this illustration as well because it does focus on a new technology that gets used in the Hundred Years' War eventually. So this piece is Walter de Malmete's treatise on kingship, and excuse my pronunciation, I really did a lot of research and tried hard to pronounce this correctly. I did not take Latin in high school, so again, excuse my pronunciation, but De nobile tatibus sapientis et prudentis regum. And this is yet another book or manuscript filled with illustrations to further enhance the information that's being presented. And in it we see what is known as one of the first illustrations depicting a gunpowder weapon. So cannon-like weaponry, like the one pictured, becomes an important technological weapon advancement during the Hundred Years' War. And I just wanted to throw that in as somewhat of a bonus, just to show that art from this war is not only capturing the brutality of battles and the significant events of the Hundred Years' War, but also just the fact that human civilization is starting to develop more strategic ways to succeed and fight in warfare. And as a whole, society is becoming more advanced and creative, and this makes sense as the English Renaissance is right around the corner as it begins in the 15th century. Alright, so back to our main topic, the Hundred Years' War. So let's just fast forward a bit from the early 1300s to around 1377, and this is when we see the death of King Edward III, who was aforementioned a very powerful and strategic king during the Hundred Years' War. Alright, so the piece pictured here is a tomb effigy for King Edward III. After his 50-year reign, King Edward III died of a stroke. And regardless of his decline in power and success, unfortunately toward the end of his life, he's still seen as a great king and a symbol of England. And that's why this tomb is so significant. It's believed to have been created a decade after his death, so around the 1380s and 1390s. And the king is memorialized in a bronze gilt with an inscription above that describes his strength as a leader, a royal, a peacemaker, and a role model. So the tomb effigy is not only an important arts installation because it memorializes the king that initiated the war in the first place, it's also a statement of pride for England, as he was a king that restored the dignity of royalty in England after his father's disastrous reign, and he also granted power and strength to the English army by building up their reputation during the war. And that brings me to the next piece of artwork that I want to talk about. Since we kind of transitioned from the bronze gilt tomb effigy of King Edward III, I wanted to bring up another metal used during the war, gold. And gold was often used to hammer gold nobles as a form of currency. I think oftentimes we forget that currency itself is a form of art, and it's actually a great historical indicator of leader figures and significant events during the past. So this piece of currency is a gold noble from the reign of Henry V, and that was around 1413 to 1422, and from the symbols hammered into the coin, we can determine a few different things. So one face of the coin shows the king with a shield, and the shield is displaying a coat of arms of royalty, most likely a statement to signify the power of royalty at the time, the power of the English royalty specifically. And then it shows him standing on top of a warboat, and this is likely to exhibit King Henry V's great power as not only a royal but also a leader in war, and especially in naval warfare. And the other side provides another statement of royalty, and it brings forth the theme of Christianity, with an ornate cross, an H for Henry in the center, again indicating who the king is at the time, and a surrounding circle of lions and crowns, which again are motifs for royalty. And moving on to the final piece of art I'd like to cover, this piece of art, I have actually multiple pieces of art, revolve around a significant figure that is well known as the patron saint of France and is most famous for her accomplishments in the Siege of Orleans, and that is Joan of Arc. Alright, so the first piece to the far left is called Joan of Arc. It's a painting done in gouache and watercolor, and the artist is unknown, but it was said to have been created around 1450 to 1500, and this is done in a Gothic style. It actually pays great tribute to Joan, as the only portrait she did sit for did not survive the wear and tear of history. But this painting is very significant. It shows her strength, her victory, her bravery, and how much of an influence that had on the French. Because we see many depictions of her even into the 1800s. And the first example I want to show of that is this painting in the middle. It's, again, called Joan of Arc, but it is by Jules Bastien Lepage, and it depicts her in a mix of realism and romanticism. And another painting that I want to point out, again from the 1800s, is this neoclassicistic painting called Joan of Arc at the coronation of Charles VII. This is by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and it's a great homage to Baroque-style paintings with the dramatic sculpture-like pose and dark contrasted lighting. It's almost very theatrical and powerful and dramatic. And both of these are significant, as they show the influence and inspiration Joan had on artists even long after the war, and her prevalence in French society and culture in general, even into modern times. And that about concludes my video on significant art that came out of the 100 Years' War. I hope you were able to learn a bit more about this war and some of the important artwork that resulted from it. And on an ending note, I just want to put this out here. Here's a list of the sources I used when creating the video. Obviously, if you want to look into them more in depth, just go ahead and pause and go ahead and read through the list of sources. So thank you.